I discovered my neighbor lying face down in the snow at 6 in the morning, and my first thought was not to call for help, but to wonder if he had finally snapped under the pressure of our HOA president's relentless enforcement campaign. My name is Gregory Patterson, and I have lived in the Whispering Pines subdivision of Stowe, Vermont for 3 years now. The community sits at the base of Mount Mansfield, a picturesque collection of 70 homes built in the 1920s as a winter retreat for wealthy Bostonians. Most of the original structures remain, their cedar shingles weathered to a silvery gray that the Architectural Review Committee insists we maintain through expensive treatments every 5 years. I purchased my home because I wanted a quieter life after 2 decades of corporate law in Manhattan, and for the most part, I had found exactly that. Until Sharon Kellerman became HOA president 8 months ago. The man in the snow was Robert Finch, my 68-year-old neighbor from 3 houses down. I rushed over and turned him onto his side, relieved to hear him groan. His face was red from the cold, but he was breathing normally. "Robert, what happened?" He blinked up at me, snow clinging to his white mustache. "Tripped over a damn rock she made me put in. Marked the boundary of where my snow removal has to stop." I helped him to his feet and walked him back to his house, where his wife Alina fussed over him with hot coffee and a heating pad. Robert had been one of the first people to warn me about Sharon when I moved in, but back then she was just a vocal board member, not the tyrannical president she would become. The incident with Robert happened on a Tuesday in January. By Friday, I received my own letter from the HOA, delivered in Sharon's signature cream-colored envelope with the Whispering Pines seal embossed on the flap. I knew it was trouble before I even opened it. "Dear Mr. Patterson," it began, in that falsely polite tone Sharon used when she was about to ruin your day. "It has come to the attention of the Whispering Pines HOA board that you have been utilizing a snow roller on the communal walking trails without prior approval. As per Section 12.4 of the revised CC and Articles, all mechanical snow removal equipment must be submitted for architectural and environmental review before use on community property. The snow roller in question has not been approved and constitutes a violation. You are hereby ordered to cease and desist all use of this equipment immediately. Failure to comply will result in daily fines of $150 beginning January 20th. Sincerely, Sharon Kellerman, HOA President." I read the letter 3 times, each time feeling my blood pressure rise another notch. The snow roller was not some industrial monstrosity. It was a vintage wooden barrel roller I had discovered in my garage, left behind by the previous owner. The thing was beautiful, nearly 100 years old, with iron bands and a long wooden handle. I had spent weeks restoring it, sanding down the oak staves, treating the wood, replacing the worn leather grip on the handle. More importantly, I had been using it to maintain the sleigh trails that crisscrossed our community. These trails were not some modern addition but original pathways from the 1920s, designed for horse-drawn sleighs. They wound through the pine forest behind our homes, connecting to the old town center about 2 miles away. Over the decades, most residents had forgotten about them, but I had found references to them in the Town Historical Society archives and had made it my personal project to bring them back to life. The snow roller was the traditional tool for maintaining such trails. Instead of plowing or blowing the snow away, it packed it down, creating a smooth, firm surface perfect for cross-country skiing, snowshoeing, or the antique sleigh that another resident, Marcus Wright, had been restoring. A dozen neighbors had thanked me for maintaining the trails. Kids used them to get to school. Elderly residents walked them for exercise. Everyone loved them except, apparently, Sharon Kellerman. I called an emergency meeting with the 3 other board members that evening. 2 of them, Patricia Vance and Thomas Littleton, met me at the community center. The third, Sharon's lapdog Dennis Kraft, refused to attend without Sharon present. "This is insane," Patricia said, sliding the letter back across the table to me. She was a retired teacher, sharp as a tack at 72, with silver hair she wore in a practical bun. "Those trails have been the best thing to happen to this community in years. My grandkids actually want to visit now." Thomas, a middle-aged accountant with a perpetually worried expression, wrung his hands. "Sharon is going to say it is about liability. If someone gets hurt on the trails and they were maintained with unapproved equipment, the HOA could be sued." "That is ridiculous," I said. "The trails are on common property that the HOA maintains. We mow them in summer. How is packing snow in winter any different?" Patricia leaned back in her chair. "It is not about logic, Gregory. Sharon wants control. She sees you doing something popular, something the community loves, and it threatens her. If people are happy with the trails, they might start questioning her other rules." She had a point. In the 8 months since Sharon had taken over, the list of new violations had grown exponentially. No wreaths on doors after January 5th. No firewood stacks visible from the street. No parking in your own driveway for more than 2 hours during daylight. Every week brought some new petty restriction, each one justified with vague references to property values and community standards. I left the meeting more frustrated than when I arrived. Thomas promised to try reasoning with Sharon, but I knew it was pointless. Patricia suggested I attend the next board meeting and make my case publicly, but that was 3 weeks away. The fines would start in 4 days. That night, I did what I should have done months ago. I went to the Stowe Historical Society. The society operated out of a converted church on Main Street, its white clapboard exterior pristine against the January snow. Inside, the smell of old paper and furniture polish reminded me of the law libraries I had haunted as a young attorney. A woman about my age looked up from a desk covered in archival boxes. "Help you?" she asked, pushing reading glasses up into her auburn hair. "I hope so. I live in Whispering Pines and I have been working to restore the old sleigh trails. My HOA just banned the snow roller I have been using to maintain them." Her eyebrows rose. "They banned a snow roller. Do they understand that is the only historically appropriate way to maintain those trails? I do not think they care about historical appropriateness." "Can you tell me more about the trails? I found some references in your archives last year, but I did not dig too deep." She stood up, a smile spreading across her face. "You found the perfect person to ask. I am Jennifer Palmer, and I wrote my master's thesis on the development of winter recreation infrastructure in early 20th century Vermont. Those trails in Whispering Pines are some of the best preserved examples in the state. Follow me." Jennifer led me into the back room, where floor-to-ceiling shelves held boxes organized by decade. She pulled down several from the 1920s and spread their contents across a research table. Photographs, maps, newspaper clippings, and handwritten journals documented the creation of Whispering Pines as a winter retreat. "Here," she said, pointing to a photograph of a man holding a snow roller identical to mine. "That is Edward Morrison, one of the developers. He brought the snow roller design from Norway, where they had been using them for centuries. The whole appeal of Whispering Pines was that it offered authentic winter recreation. They advertised the sleigh trails in Boston newspapers." She pulled out more documents, and I took notes furiously. The trails had been a central feature of the development. mentioned explicitly in the original property deeds as a community amenity. Several articles from the 1920s and 1930s described winter festivals where dozens of sleighs would parade through the trails. There were photographs of families gathered around fire pits along the routes, children being pulled on toboggans, even one of a wedding party arriving by sleigh. "This is incredible," I said. The trails were not just random paths. They were the main selling point of the entire development. Jennifer nodded enthusiastically. "Absolutely. And the snow roller was essential. You cannot plow sleigh trails because you need the snow base. Snow blowers create an uneven surface. Rolling packs the snow uniformly and preserves the integrity of the trail bed underneath. It is the only method that does not damage the historic landscape. Would you be willing to document this? Write something official that I could present to my HOA." She was already pulling out a form. "Better than that. I can apply to have the trails designated as a historic landscape feature. If approved, they would be protected under Vermont's historic preservation statutes. Your HOA would not be able to ban their maintenance." We worked until the Historical Society closed at 8, compiling documentation. Jennifer explained that the application process would take months, but she could provide me with a preliminary assessment immediately. By the time I left, I had a folder 3 inches thick with evidence that the trails were historically significant and that the snow roller was the only appropriate maintenance method. The weekend passed quietly, but I knew the storm was coming. Monday morning, right on schedule, Sharon appeared at my door at 7 in the morning. She was 52, with blonde hair that she wore in a helmet-like style that never moved, even in Vermont's fierce winter winds. She wore a black wool coat that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment, and carried a leather portfolio that I knew contained fresh copies of the violation notice. "Good morning, Gregory," she said, her smile as warm as the January wind. "I wanted to personally follow up on the cease and desist letter you received regarding your snow roller. Sharon, I got your letter. I am working on a response." "There is nothing to respond to. The rules are clear. Unapproved equipment is not permitted on community property." The trails are not community property in the traditional sense. They are historic features that she held up a manicured hand. "I do not have time for a history lesson. The board has made its decision. If I see that roller on the trails after Wednesday, you will be fined. Good day." She turned on her expensive boots and marched back to her Lexus, leaving me fuming on my front porch. Several neighbors had watched the exchange from their windows. Within an hour, my phone started ringing. The first call was from Marcus Wright, the sleigh restoration enthusiast. "Gregory, please tell me she is not really banning the roller. I am so close to finishing the sleigh. We were going to do a test run next month. She is serious, but I am fighting it. I have documentation from the Historical Society proving the trails are historically significant. Do you need help? I have some contacts in the State Preservation Office." The second call was from Alina Finch, Robert's wife. "We heard what happened. Robert wants you to know he will testify about the trails. He remembers using them as a boy when his grandparents had a house here." More calls followed. Patricia Vance called to say she was putting together a petition. A young mother named Alice Bradford called to say the trails were the only place her autistic son felt comfortable playing outside. Even Thomas Littleton called, whispering because Sharon was apparently in the community center office next to his. The support was heartening, but it also made the stakes clearer. This was not just about me or my snow roller. The trails had become something important to the community, a connection to the past and a gathering place in the present. Sharon threatening them threatened something larger. Tuesday afternoon, I received an email from Jennifer at the Historical Society. She had completed her preliminary assessment and attached a 15-page document detailing the historical significance of the Whispering Pines sleigh trails. She had also contacted the Vermont Division for Historic Preservation, and they were expediting a review of her formal application for historic designation. I immediately forwarded the document to all board members and requested an emergency meeting. Patricia responded within minutes, agreeing. Thomas took an hour but eventually agreed. Dennis ignored the email entirely, and Sharon responded with a single line. The board decision stands. See you at the monthly meeting. Wednesday morning arrived. The fines were supposed to start today if I used the roller. I stood in my garage, looking at the beautiful old wooden barrel, and made my decision. I would use it anyway. The trails needed maintenance, especially after the fresh snow we had gotten overnight. If Sharon wanted to find me, she would have to prove I was actually the one rolling the trails. I waited until after 9, when I knew Sharon would be at her weekly hair appointment in town. Then I hauled the roller out to the main trailhead and began my work. The fresh powder compressed beautifully under the weight of the barrel, creating that perfect packed surface. I worked quickly, finishing the main loop in just over an hour. As I was heading back, I ran into Marcus Wright, who was cross-country skiing the newly rolled section. "This is perfect," he called out. "The sleigh is going to glide like a dream on this surface." "Let us hope we get to find out," I said. That afternoon, the violation notice appeared on my door. Sharon must have had spotters. The letter informed me that I had been observed using the snow roller and was hereby fined $150. Payment was due within 10 days, or the amount would increase to $300. I scanned the letter and emailed it to Jennifer Palmer, along with a note asking if she had any suggestions. Her response came back within the hour. "Do not pay the fine. You are maintaining a historic feature using the traditional and appropriate method. I have copied the State Preservation Office on this email. They are very interested in your case." That should have been the end of it for the day, but Sharon was just getting started. At 6 that evening, a process server appeared at my door with legal documents. The HOA was filing for an injunction to prevent me from using the snow roller and seeking reimbursement for legal fees incurred to enforce community standards. I called my former colleague, Mitchell Sato, who now practiced in Vermont after retiring from the Manhattan firm where we had worked together. Mitchell specialized in property law and laughed when I explained the situation. "She is suing you over a snow roller." "Gregory, this is the most Vermont thing I have ever heard. Send me everything. I will handle this pro bono. It has been too long since I had a fun case." The next few days were a blur of legal documents and community drama. Patricia's petition gathered over 40 signatures from residents supporting the trails. Jennifer Palmer's formal application to the State Preservation Office made the local news, with a reporter from the Stowe Reporter coming out to interview me and photograph the trails. Marcus Wright appeared in the article too, showing off his nearly completed sleigh and explaining how the trails were essential to his restoration project. Sharon responded by calling a special board meeting to discuss member conduct violations and community harmony. The meeting was scheduled for Saturday afternoon at the community center, and every resident received a formal notice that attendance was strongly encouraged. Saturday arrived with clear skies and bitter cold, the kind of January day where the snow squeaks under your boots and your breath crystallizes in the air. The community center was packed by 2 o'clock, with people standing along the walls when the seats filled up. Sharon sat at the head table with Dennis Kraft, her ever-present yes man. Thomas Littleton looked ill, and Patricia Vance had positioned herself at the opposite end of the table from Sharon, as far as physically possible. Sharon called the meeting to order with her gavel, a literal wooden gavel she had purchased for herself when she became president. "Thank you all for attending this important meeting. We are here to discuss a serious matter of community standards and rule enforcement." She launched into a prepared speech about the importance of following HOA rules, about how property values depended on consistent enforcement, about how allowing one person to break the rules would lead to chaos. She spoke for 15 minutes without mentioning the snow roller specifically, but everyone knew what she was talking about. When she finally finished, Patricia immediately requested the floor. "I move that we table this discussion until the State Preservation Office completes its review of the sleigh trail's historical status." "Motion denied," Sharon said. "This is not a discussion. This is an enforcement meeting." "Actually," Thomas said quietly, "if a board member makes a motion, we have to vote on it. That is in our bylaws." Sharon's face flushed red, but she could not argue with the bylaws she loved to weaponize against others. "Fine. All in favor of tabling this discussion?" Patricia and Thomas raised their hands. Dennis kept his down. Sharon was required to vote as president only in case of a tie, and the motion passed. "This is not over," Sharon said, her voice tight with anger. "The violation stands and the fine stands." But something had shifted in the room. I could feel it. Residents who had been intimidated by Sharon's rule were starting to push back. After the official meeting ended, a dozen people came up to thank me for fighting. Robert Finch, recovered from his fall, announced that he was running for president in the upcoming election. Alina told Sharon directly that her leadership had become toxic. Sharon left without speaking to anyone, Dennis trailing behind her like a shadow. The following Tuesday, Jennifer Palmer called with significant news. The State Preservation Office completed their expedited review. They are designating the Whispering Pines sleigh trails as a historic landscape feature, effective immediately. More than that, they are requiring the HOA to maintain the trails using historically appropriate methods, which means the snow roller. I felt like I had won the lottery. They are requiring it. Yes. The trails are now protected under state law. Any attempt to prevent their proper maintenance could result in fines against the HOA itself. I am emailing you the official documentation now. I immediately forwarded the documentation to the entire board and every resident on the community email list. The response was overwhelming. Patricia called to congratulate me. Thomas sent a sheepish email apologizing for not standing up to Sharon earlier. Marcus Wright came over with a bottle of expensive whiskey to celebrate. Sharon's response arrived at midnight. A mass email to all residents, explaining that while the state had made its ruling, the HOA still had the right to regulate the times and manner of trail maintenance. I would be restricted to rolling the trails only between the hours of 10 and 11 in the morning on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and I would need to post notice 48 hours in advance of any rolling. Mitchell Sato read the email and laughed. She is grasping at straws. Those restrictions are arbitrary and not enforceable. The state ruling gives you broad authority to maintain the trails as needed. Ignore her. But ignoring Sharon was never a simple proposition. She showed up at my house the next morning at 6:30, pounding on the door until I answered. She thrust her phone in my face, showing a photo of the trails. "You rolled these yesterday afternoon," she said. "That is a violation of the new maintenance schedule." "Sharon, there is no maintenance schedule. The state has given me authority to maintain historic features using appropriate methods. Your arbitrary time restrictions do not apply. I am the HOA president. Everything in this community applies through me. You are not a dictator. You are an elected official of a volunteer board, and you are way out of line." Her face went through several shades of red. "You have no idea who you are dealing with. I will make your life miserable here. Every single thing you do, I will find a violation. You will spend more on fines than your house is worth. Are you threatening me? I am promising you." She turned and left, but this time her threat felt different. She was not just angry anymore. She was desperate. Her control was slipping, and she knew it. Over the next 2 weeks, Sharon made good on her promise. I received violation notices for having my trash cans visible from the street for 15 minutes while I loaded them into my car. I received a notice for having a single icicle hanging from my gutter. I received a notice because my walkway snow shoveling pattern did not match the approved community standard of perpendicular lines. Each notice came with a $50 fine. Mitchell advised me not to pay any of them, as they were clearly retaliatory and would never hold up in court. Other residents started receiving similar harassment. Anyone who had signed Patricia's petition found themselves under Sharon's microscope. Robert Finch got a notice about his mailbox being a 1/4 inch too tall. Eleanor got one because her house numbers were supposedly faded. The community was reaching a breaking point. A recall petition started circulating to remove Sharon from the board, and it quickly gathered the required signatures. The recall election was scheduled for March 15th, just 6 weeks away. Sharon's response to the recall was to double down. She called another special meeting, this time to discuss significant capital assessments needed for community infrastructure. When residents arrived, she presented a proposal requiring each household to pay $5,000 for emergency repairs to the community center roof. Thomas Littleton, who had finally found his spine, stood up during the presentation. "I reviewed the community center roof last week with a contractor. There is nothing wrong with it. This is a manufactured crisis." "Are you calling me a liar?" Sharon demanded. "I am saying your assessment is incorrect. I have the contractor's report here if anyone wants to see it." Chaos erupted. Residents shouted questions. Dennis tried to defend Sharon but could not explain what repairs were actually needed. Patricia moved to table the assessment until an independent inspection could be completed. The motion passed, and Sharon stormed out of her own meeting. But Sharon was not done. 2 days later, residents received letters informing them that the HOA was implementing a new parking enforcement system. Every vehicle would need to register with the HOA and display an official decal. Visitors would need to obtain temporary permits. Any vehicle without proper documentation would be towed at owner's expense. The parking scheme was the final straw. Multiple residents contacted attorneys. The local news picked up the story, with reporters interviewing frustrated homeowners about the HOA's increasingly aggressive tactics. Sharon refused to comment, but Dennis gave a rambling interview about maintaining order that made things worse. Then the story went viral. Someone had compiled Sharon's most egregious violation notices and posted them to a property owners' rights forum. From there, it spread to Reddit, then Twitter, then local news stations across New England. Whispering Pines became a cautionary tale about HOA overreach, and Sharon Kellerman became the face of petty tyranny. The attention brought unexpected allies. The Vermont chapter of the Institute for Justice, a libertarian legal organization, reached out and offered to represent the community in any legal action against the HOA board. A state legislator introduced a bill to reform HOA enforcement powers, citing our situation specifically. Sharon's response to all this was to hire her own attorney and threaten to sue residents for defamation. Her lawyer sent out cease and desist letters to anyone who had spoken to the press. Mitchell reviewed my letter and advised me to ignore it. She has no case. Truth is an absolute defense to defamation, and everything that has been reported is documented fact. The recall election became the focal point of everything. Robert Finch ran against Sharon on a platform of reasonable governance and community cooperation. His campaign slogan was simple: "Take back our neighborhood." Patricia Vance ran for one of the other board seats, as did Alice Bradford, the mother whose son loved the trails. Sharon's campaign was less a campaign than a series of angry emails about how she was being persecuted for trying to maintain standards. Dennis ran for re-election as her slate mate, though his heart clearly was not in it anymore. The election was held on a cold Tuesday evening in mid-March. Turnout was nearly 100%, something the election committee said had never happened before. I voted right at 6 when the polls opened, then joined a group of neighbors at Robert's house to wait for the results. The count took 2 hours. When the results were finally posted, it was a landslide. Robert won 62 votes to Sharon's 8. Patricia and Alice both won their races easily. Dennis lost by an even wider margin than Sharon. I expected Sharon to accept the results gracefully, or at least quietly. Instead, she immediately sent an email to all residents claiming the election had been fraudulent and that she would not be stepping down. She cited vague irregularities and demanded a recount. Mitchell explained that Sharon had no authority to refuse. The election was valid, and she was no longer president as of midnight. If she attempted to continue acting as president, she could be personally liable for any actions she took. But Sharon did not care about liability. The next morning, she showed up at the community center and refused to leave the office. Robert arrived to begin his transition, and she physically blocked the door. "This is still my office," she said. "The election was invalid. Sharon, you lost. It is time to let someone else lead. I will not be pushed out by a mob of ungrateful people who do not understand what I have done for this community." Robert tried to reason with her, but she would not budge. Finally, he had no choice but to call the Stowe Police Department. 2 officers arrived and explained to Sharon that she needed to vacate the office. She refused, claiming she was being illegally removed. The officers were patient, explaining multiple times that she had been voted out in a legitimate election and no longer had any authority. Sharon responded by calling her attorney on speakerphone. The attorney, to his credit, immediately advised her to leave and said he could no longer represent her if she continued. Sharon hung up on her own lawyer and crossed her arms. "I am not leaving." At that point, the officers informed her that she was trespassing and would be arrested if she did not leave voluntarily. Sharon actually laughed, as if she could not believe they were serious. When they took out handcuffs, her expression changed. "You cannot arrest me. I am the president of this HOA. Madam, you were the president. Now you are trespassing. Please step outside." Sharon finally walked out, but not before sweeping all the files off the desk and screaming that we would all regret this. The officers escorted her to her car and watched until she drove away. I thought that would be the end of it. Sharon would go home, accept reality, and we would all move on with rebuilding the community. But that night, someone vandalized the trails. Deep gouges had been cut into the rolled snow with some kind of tool, making them unusable. The wooden sign at the trail head had been smashed. Marcus Wright discovered the damage early the next morning and immediately called me. We walked the trails together, documenting everything with photos. The destruction was thorough and deliberate, clearly intended to make the trails unusable. "This has to be Sharon," Marcus said. "Who else would do this?" I did not want to jump to conclusions, but I had trouble imagining anyone else with a motive. I called the police non-emergency line and filed a report. The officer who came out took statements and photographs but was honest about the challenges. "Unless you have witnesses or video evidence, it is hard to prove who did this," he said. "I will increase patrols in this area, but your best bet is to install security cameras." That afternoon, several of us pitched in to buy trail cameras, the kind hunters used to monitor wildlife. We mounted them at key points along the trails, carefully camouflaged. Then I spent the rest of the day repairing the damage, rolling the trails smooth again. 2 nights later, the cameras caught someone. At 2 in the morning, a figure in dark clothing appeared and began attacking the trails with a garden rake and shovel. The person's face was partially visible in the infrared footage, and while the image was not crystal clear, it was clear enough to identify. It was Dennis Kraft. I immediately called the police and provided them with the footage. By noon the next day, officers had visited Dennis at his home. He initially denied any involvement, but when confronted with the video evidence, he broke down and confessed. He claimed Sharon had convinced him to do it, telling him they needed to teach the community a lesson about respecting authority. The police arrested Dennis for criminal mischief, and he was charged with a misdemeanor. But the more serious development came when he agreed to cooperate with the police in exchange for a lighter sentence. He told them that Sharon had been the mastermind, that she had driven him to the trails both times and waited in the car while he did the damage. Based on Dennis's testimony and some additional evidence from his phone, including text messages from Sharon with specific instructions, the police arrested Sharon Kellerman the following day. She was charged with conspiracy to commit criminal mischief, and because the trails were now a state-protected historic site, additional charges related to damaging historic property. Sharon's arrest made headlines across Vermont and even got picked up by national news outlets. The HOA horror story that had gone viral was now a cautionary tale about what happened when petty power went unchecked. Sharon hired a criminal defense attorney and maintained her innocence, claiming Dennis had acted alone and was lying to save himself. The criminal case moved slowly, as such cases do. Sharon was released on bail and forbidden from coming to Whispering Pines or contacting any residents. The HOA's attorney filed paperwork to permanently remove her from any future board consideration. The State Preservation Office increased patrols around the trails and installed additional monitoring equipment. Meanwhile, Robert Finch proved to be everything Sharon was not. His first act as president was to eliminate all the arbitrary fines Sharon had imposed. His second was to form a community committee to review and streamline the HOA rules, removing anything that was petty or unenforceable. The parking decal scheme was scrapped. The arbitrary maintenance schedules were eliminated. Common sense returned to Whispering Pines. Marcus Wright finished his sleigh restoration in April, just as the last snow was melting. We organized a community celebration, inviting everyone to see the sleigh and walk the trails one final time before spring. Over 50 people showed up, including Jennifer Palmer from the Historical Society, who gave a short talk about the trail's history. Marcus hitched his sleigh to a pair of borrowed draft horses and gave rides on what remained of the packed snow. Kids laughed and parents took photos. Someone set up a table with hot chocolate and cookies. It felt like the community gatherings that must have happened here 100 years ago, back when the trails were new and the future felt full of possibility. I stood with Robert and Patricia, watching the celebration unfold. "This almost did not happen," I said. "If Sharon had gotten her way, the trails would be gone and we would all be miserable." Robert shook his head. "She did not get her way because you fought back. You gave the rest of us permission to stand up for ourselves. And you brought us evidence that we could not ignore, Patricia added. The Historical Society documentation changed everything. It took the fight from personal opinion to objective fact. We stood in comfortable silence, watching kids tumble out of the sleigh and immediately run to get back in line for another ride. This was what community was supposed to feel like. Not rules and restrictions and constant surveillance, but shared spaces and shared joy. The criminal trial for Sharon and Dennis was scheduled for August. Both had rejected plea deals, with Sharon maintaining her innocence and Dennis apparently changing his mind about cooperating. Mitchell warned me that I might be called as a witness, given my role in installing the cameras that had caught Dennis. As spring turned to summer, life in Whispering Pines settled into a new rhythm. The trails remained, marked now with official state historic site signs that Jennifer had helped secure. Plans were underway to create a small museum display in the community center about the trail's history, featuring some of the photographs and documents from the Historical Society archives. Marcus's sleigh was moved to the community center's garage, where it would be stored and maintained as a community asset. He was already planning next winter's activities, including monthly moonlight sleigh rides and a revival of the old winter festival that had once been a Whispering Pines tradition. My snow roller stayed in my garage, but now with a plaque that Jennifer had made identifying it as a historic tool. Several reporters had asked to photograph it, and it had appeared in at least a dozen articles about the case. I sometimes thought about that morning when I had to decide whether to use it despite Sharon's ban. Everything that followed had flowed from that one choice. The trial finally began on August 12th in Vermont Superior Court. I attended the first day, sitting in the public gallery with Robert, Patricia, and about a dozen other Whispering Pines residents. Sharon sat with her attorney at the defense table, her expression rigid. Dennis sat separately with his own lawyer, looking small and defeated. The prosecution's case was straightforward. They presented the video evidence from the trail cameras, showing Dennis clearly damaging the trails. They presented text messages from Sharon to Dennis with instructions about fixing the trail problem. They called me to testify about discovering the damage and installing the cameras. Sharon's attorney tried to argue that the text messages were being misinterpreted, that Sharon had meant something different by fixing the trail problem. But the prosecution produced more messages, including one where Sharon explicitly wrote, "Go late at night. Make sure no one sees you. Use the rake." Dennis's attorney tried a different approach, arguing that his client had been manipulated by Sharon, that she had convinced him they were acting to protect the community. He painted Dennis as a follower who had been led astray by a dominant personality. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. They found Dennis guilty of criminal mischief, but recommended leniency given his cooperation and apparent remorse. They found Sharon guilty of conspiracy to commit criminal mischief and of damaging historic property, both misdemeanors in Vermont, but carrying potential jail time. Sentencing was scheduled for September. In the meantime, both were released on bail with continued restrictions on contacting residents or visiting Whispering Pines. The sentencing hearing was less dramatic than the trial. Dennis received a suspended sentence, 2 years probation, and 200 hours of community service. The judge made clear that he was getting leniency only because of his clean record and apparent remorse. Sharon received 6 months in county jail, with credit for time served, followed by 2 years probation. She was also ordered to pay restitution for the damage to the trails and for the HOA's legal expenses. The judge's comments were sharp. "Miss Kellerman, You held a position of trust in your community. Instead of serving your neighbors, you terrorized them. When you lost power democratically, you resorted to vandalism and manipulation. You have shown no remorse and no understanding of the harm you caused. I hope you will use your time in custody to reflect on how power should be used responsibly." Sharon stood stone-faced through the entire speech. She was led away by bailiffs, and that was the last time I saw her in person. The story had ripples beyond just Sharon's fate. The Vermont legislature passed new HOA reform laws, limiting fines for violations, requiring more transparency in rule enforcement, and creating an appeal process for homeowners. Several other states contacted Vermont lawmakers about adapting the legislation for their own use. The Institute for Justice used our case as an example in their advocacy work for property rights reform. Jennifer Palmer published a paper about the trails in a historic preservation journal. Marcus Wright's sleigh was featured in a Vermont tourism video, bringing visitors to Stowe specifically to see it. As for me, I went back to the quiet life I had sought when I moved to Vermont. I maintained the trails through the winter, using my historic snow roller without any interference. I helped Robert and Patricia manage the HOA, which now operated on principles of service rather than enforcement. I kept in touch with Jennifer Palmer, who became a good friend and occasional dinner companion. The following winter, on a clear January day much like the one when this all started, I was rolling the trails when a family approached on cross-country skis. The father, probably in his 30s, stopped to watch me work. "That is amazing," he said. "Is that an actual antique roller?" "About 100 years old," I said. "Original to this community. My kids have been loving these trails. We just moved to Stowe in October and finding this place has been incredible." "Are you with the Historical Society?" "Just a resident who appreciates history," I said. His wife skied up with 2 children. "Can we take a picture?" The kids are doing a school project about traditional winter activities. I posed with the roller while they took photos, then spent 10 minutes explaining how it worked and why packing snow was better than plowing for sleigh trails. The kids listened with the kind of attention that reminded me why preservation mattered. These trails were not just historic artifacts. They were living connections to the past, and now they would be here for another generation. As the family skied away, I resumed my work, falling into the rhythm of push and pull, watching the barrel compress the snow into that perfect smooth surface. Above me, pine trees stood heavy with snow against a brilliant blue sky. Behind me, the trail stretched back through the woods toward the community where I had finally found home. Somewhere across town, Sharon Kellerman was serving her sentence, probably bitter about how things had turned out. Dennis Kraft was doing community service, maybe learning lessons about integrity and choosing better influences. The HOA board was meeting to plan a spring cleanup day. The Historical Society was cataloging new donations for their archives. And I was here, maintaining trails with a traditional method that had worked for 100 years and would work for 100 more. Because sometimes the old ways are the best ways, and sometimes fighting for what matters means standing up to people who confuse authority with power. The snow squeaked under the roller. The sun warmed my face despite the cold, and the trails stretched ahead, waiting to be walked by anyone who wanted to experience a piece of history. That was worth fighting for. That would always be worth fighting for.